Okay. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank our founder, John McLaughlin, for creating this organization, Marie Summers, who's out front, our Director of Communications, Carmen, for photographing this, and of course our speaker, Karen Huntsberger. I'd just also like to remind you we have our holiday Christmas party coming up, and that is going to be on December 14th at Mayfair Farms. It's $75 per person, so I hope you all can join us. It'll be a fun evening, and we have a speaker coming from France. Her name is Sarah Kaminsky, and she'll be talking about her father, who was a master forger for the French resistance during World War II. So it proves to be very interesting. Karen Berkey Huntsberger grew up with a father who was excited about life and found joy in simple things and discovered beauty everywhere. He never talked about the war, which was pretty typical of most World War II vets. 17 years ago, after her father passed away, his war journals and letters came to light. In 2009, Karen began the process of researching and compiling his journals, letters, and historical reports. The resulting book provides a close-up, and that book is for sale on the corner there after the lecture. It provides a close-up view of the impact of World War II and the impact it had on one family that was, like so many others, waiting for peace. Karen developed at an early age a love of writing, genealogy, history, and the power of place from hearing the stories of her grandmother, a genealogist, whose letters are prominently featured in the book. Karen is also a professional musician and a nationally certified piano teacher with 35 years experience. She lives in McMinnville, Oregon, with her husband. Together they're working on producing a multimedia documentary based on her book. So without further ado, Karen.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here tonight. I've known about you guys long before you knew about me. I've spent 5 years researching the book, and in many of my little research questions, I came up with the New Jersey World War II Book Club. And so I knew about it for years, maybe at this point like 5 years. And I've watched a lot of your videos online, and I've sure appreciated all the information I've received that way. I couldn't find an email address for you guys for years, so finally I was looking through your holiday pictures, and there was an email on a table skirt, believe it or not. So a year ago I emailed, and Dr. McLaughlin replied to me, and I just wanted you guys to know about my book. I never expected to be invited to speak here, and when he asked me, I thought, oh, no, I can't do that. I live on the other side of the country. But then, you know, I thought I can do that. And so I'm so happy to be here. My husband is here with me tonight, and we're actually going to have some vacation days in New York City. We've enjoyed, I can't say enjoyed, the freeways around here today. You know what I mean? Okay. I also never thought I would be speaking to a World War II book club. When I was a kid, I avoided World War II the plague. I did the minimum I could to deal with it in high school of what I had to learn. I didn't want to know. And I knew my father had been in the war. I'd seen the scars on his arm. I knew sometimes he would space out, and you know, you'd be speaking to him, and he wouldn't answer. My mother would say, give him a minute, he's back in the war, just wait. And then he'd snap out of it. But as Rich said a few minutes ago, he was an extremely happy person, and I think that's part of a result of our experience. He lived through such horrible, horrible things that he wanted to be happy. So here we are in New Jersey today. My book's called For Peace. Asked me about the title, and I feel like I've all been waiting for peace. I've been waiting my entire life. I think, you know, during World War people waited for years, and then there was peace for a while, for a few years. But it pretty much not happened in Europe. During World War II, his name was Richard Berkey. The cover picture is him standing in the Burghof, a window, the front window of Hitler's bombed out house. A fantastic picture to own. It's just amazing that he got the opportunity to go there. So you might wonder why I'm starting with a picture of a basketball team. And I'm glad I decided to do this when I came into this beautiful library tonight right away, my husband and I noticed this library is built as a memorial to World War II veterans. Those beautiful gold letters down in the entrance. And not only that, it was built in 1954, the year I was born. So it makes me feel even happier about that. Why I have this picture here is because every one of these guys on this team served in World War II. My father is number 26 up here on the right. One of his very dear friends died in the war. The rest of these guys all went to war and they all came back in one form or another. One of them is still living. Why this is important is the same reason it was important to this community to honor these men whose names are in the books downstairs. World War II deeply affected virtually every spot in America. And a small town, everybody rallied around their World War II soldiers. And the reason I have this photo is because the little town Dad was from got featured in 1939 in Life magazine. My dad was a Hoosier basketball star from southern Indiana. And you think, how does this relate? Well, it relates because all these guys went to war. But here they were happy. They were pretty happy because it was still 2 years before Pearl Harbor. This is a picture. It was a photo spread. All of you will remember Life magazine and how fun it was to look at the pictures. Fortunately, there wasn't much to read, right? We enjoyed the captions. My mother's in that photo somewhere. But here's the team. My dad is slouched over there on your left. And the guy coming to the little town of Salem, Indiana, which is about population 4,000, was a big deal for this town to be written up in Life magazine. And my grandfather said, this was the day before Thanksgiving, he invited the photographer, who was also the writer, to come to Thanksgiving dinner the next day. So if you go online and look at this magazine, you will see Thanksgiving dinner at the Berkey household. Why this is important, I'm sure the same it was for this area here. As I said before, every member served in World War II. The number of men from the county my dad lived in that served was 2,017. The number of women was 30. At that time, that was 12% of the population there. That's a huge, huge number from that county. But you can see all those young, beautiful men, those young, healthy men, of course, they were going to go to war. 109 of them died. 2 people have already asked me tonight how I came to write this book. Now I'm going to answer that question, because it was a surprise to me. My dad kept a journal all of his life, and you could see he had horrible handwriting, which is always a chore for us. And these journals right here, this one is October 1st, this 1944, and he has about 2 weeks of loose papers like that. On this one he writes that he had gotten a pass to go home from Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and it was the last time he got to go home before he got sent overseas. And he writes that he and his best friend, Buster Crockett, who we'll see later, he says that they get drunk on the way home. They stop on the train and get drunk somewhere. Then they come home and clean it up. And at the bottom he writes how hard it was to say goodbye to his parents, thinking he may never see them again. And then they get drunk on the way back to Camp Campbell. Now my dad was not a drinker, so this is interesting. This journal right here is what he carried the whole time he was in Europe during the war. It says Medical Department, U.S. Army. This was once white medical tape. It's pretty dirty. I think the only reason he was able to keep a journal was because he was a medic, and he was able to hide it and not get caught. It's a treasure. I'm so grateful to have it. It's probably half the size of this thing I'm holding up right here. So we had his journals. In fact, I have all of his journals. My mother typed this up in 1995. I did not mention that my father died young, suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 69 in 1991. It was a shock to everybody. He was just gone. And in 1995, my mother got to go on a battalion reunion. Dad was in the 14th Armored Division, 68th Armored Infantry Battalion, Company C, 3rd Platoon. So she got to go with Buster Crockett's family on this tour. When she came home, she was so interested. She got that journal out, did her best to read it and type it up. And it was 26 pages originally, lots of German names spelled wrong, lots of words missing. I never read it when she typed it up. I was never offered the opportunity to read it until just about a month before she passed away in November of 2008. When I read it, I thought it was the most compelling thing I'd ever read. And granted, it was my father, but it could be any soldier. And that's why, it's one of the reasons I published the book. It could be anyone's story, any soldier's story. When we cleaned out Mother's house, I was down in the scummy basement, and here I found 2 great Rubbermaid containers full of about 200 letters. These were the letters to and from Dad during the war, letters he'd sent home, letters his parents and siblings and friends had sent to him. And to me, it was a moment of a lifetime because I realized I had the rest of the story. I thought I had the rest of the story at that point. And I think it's rare to be able to have a journal and the letters back and forth, so I was so thrilled. But I didn't get to work on it for about a year. Here's some examples of the letters. On the one on the left, he says he's in France, which is amazing that didn't get censored. He says he's now seen Marseille. And everybody knows about V-mail here, I'm sure, right? I don't need to explain that. Most groups I speak to, I need to explain that. What's interesting about this one is that his commanding officer was the censor. It says up in the top left corner, John L. Battenfeld, and we'll see his picture later. And the censor job, as most of you I'm sure know, was not a coveted job. None of Dad's letters were ever censored, blacked out, nothing cut out of them. So that was a gift too. Here's some letters that he received from his parents. His mother, my grandmother, I love this. She writes on Halloween 1944. She says, "Dearest boy," I love this. He's 22 years old and she's writing, "Dearest boy, we have not heard from you. It's been 19 days. Of course, this is every parent's complaint about their children anyway, whether they're off to war or not. And then she goes on and talks about the other boys in the town. I'm sure just like here in Milburn, people shared letters, they shared news of any soldier that was serving that they knew or they knew their family. He even saved a little piece of Christmas wrapping paper. And this was just like tissue paper with ancient Scotch tape up on the corner. His sister Lucy was a wave. She had been to college and gotten an art degree and was teaching school art. She hated it because she didn't want to judge kids' papers. She didn't want to have to give them an A or B. So the WAVE program came along and she said, "Sign me up for that." She went to Hunter College in New York, met a lot of great women. And that's my next book I'm working on, is about the WAVE program, because I do have all of Lucy's letters too. She ended up serving in Washington, D.C. The reason this package was important was rationing wasn't as big of a deal in Washington, D.C. as it was in southern Indiana. So she could send my dad things that they maybe couldn't get at home. Here's some pictures of Lucy as a wave. And I don't think she likes this guy's arm around her on the right here, and I don't know who these other people are, but she was a tiny little thing. What I loved about the WAVE program was that you just didn't go in and say, "Okay, you're going to be a WAVE now, you have to do this." They asked women what they were good at. What is your skills? Where can we best use what you know how to do? Since she was an artist, they had her work in map making. So she was in the Navy Hydrographic Office in DC. She does complain a lot about her eyesight, and the detailed map making. So I had all of these things, and you'd think that would be enough to create the story and put it together. But I didn't feel like I had enough. Beyond the letters and the journals, I also had tons of mementos. As you know, men brought back lots and lots of things. My dad had stamps, coins, bills, Nazi items, all of his medic stuff, on and on and on. Saved newspapers from wherever he could get them. And so I had all of these things. And I also had to make the decisions that every author makes of where to start to make this story clear. The biggest decision, though, I had to make was whether to make it public or not. And I know a lot of people have letters that they want to share just with their family. And it took me 2 years to make the decision to make it public. And I think there's 2 reasons I decided. What I said before, that it could be anybody's story, any American family story of how they got through World War II. And I don't want kids to not know about World War II. I want kids who've not grown up with it, who've not had a parent or grandparent. I want kids to know what happened so that we never repeat it. And I'm so pleased that the high school principal in my little town bought 20 copies of my book. His dad was a World War II veteran, and he said after a speech he attended of mine, I want every history teacher and every writing teacher in my high school to have a copy of your book so people don't forget, so that we don't have World War III. I talked about Buster Crockett a minute ago. He and my dad were best friends growing up. They lived a block from each other. They ended up both in the 14th Armored Division. Buster in Company B, Dad in Company C. And they saw each other for a while until they sort of had to be going different places in various battles. Here's some other pictures of Buster. Buster ended up being a large part of our family just because of the friendship. And after my father died, my mother and Buster dated for 16 years. So, which is an unusual story, I know. But it was great. It was wonderful because got a whole other family. So these 2 men and my mother had this great relationship. Not all at the same time. So there's Buster, and that's after the war was over in southern France. We're not exactly sure of the location of the picture on the right. Buster just passed away 2 years ago. I was so thrilled to have 90 period photos to use, which is another great thing I had. Here's a picture of Dad. Now, none of us would put up with a photo like this anymore. With our iPhones, we'd look at that and go, oh no, I'll fix that right now. But there's Dad in the middle and 2 of his sisters. Lucy, who's got the white shirt on. Oh no, Lucy's the wave. Virginia on the other side. She was in college at the time and she wanted to become a nurse. She wanted to go to war. She writes to Dad, I want to be over there helping you. And she did go in the Cadet Nurse Corps after she graduated, but the war was over and she never got to fulfill that, real need to help that she had. And then Dad's older sister, you can only see her chin up there at the top. That's Eleanor. She's still living. She was only 16 at the time. Here's some pictures from wartime. A number of you, I'm sure, recognize General Albert C. Smith there in the middle. That's Dad receiving his Bronze Star. Down here on the right is the reason I have these period photos. This man right here, who's 19 in this picture, is Norman Eliason. He became a lifelong friend of my father, and at some point they liberated a camera factory along the route. And any boy that wanted a camera and some film, they just took it. So Norman took advantage of that opportunity, and thank goodness, because it got all these great photos. This is at the end of the war, but Norman here ended up coming back, going to Columbia University on the GI Bill, and became an interpreter. He worked for the Pentagon for his whole career and was very instrumental in a peace accord in Europe in the 1960s. They were great friends always. This man right here, Alan Goldstein, he was a medic also. He also happened to be Jewish. It was particularly difficult for him. The 14th Armored Division was known as the Liberators, and they ended up liberating some very difficult to see places. And I recently met his widow in April. I thought, my goodness, how could she still be among us? When I found her phone number, I just assumed it was his daughter. I called and left a message. She calls me back and says, Karen, I've got chills. I'm not his daughter, I'm his wife. I ended up going to Phoenix and meeting her. She was his second wife. She knew he had been in the war. He never said a word. I gave her a copy of the book and all the photos I had of him. And so this woman got to see her husband as a young man, which she never knew anything about it. So that was, they were so thrilled, and her two daughters were so thrilled to get that information. Some other photos here. Here they have a flat tire. They talk about this. Dad writes about it in the book. I know this was my dad any day because of how he's holding his hands. He had that habit all of his life. If I couldn't see his face, I would know that was him. I was talking about the liberators a few minutes ago. These two pictures are near Moosburg. And this is where the 14th Armored Division liberated a prison camp here. And these were prisoners of war. When they first liberated it, they thought there were only 30,000 men in there. Turns out there were 110,000 men. And of course, this was a huge, huge deal. I'm sure many of you know more about these camps than I do. But Dad wrote at the time, he says, "What a sight, it made tears come into my eyes. We gave the GIs about all we had, including champagne." They had liberated a champagne factory like the day before. Now, the 14th Armored Division didn't get that name Liberators until after the war was over. The National Holocaust Museum's website says that the 14th Armored Division uncovered several subcamps of Dachau. Near Ampfing and Moldorf, they discovered 4 large munitions plants built underground. They found 15,000 tons of explosives, 3 forced labor camps, which were holding thousands of Polish and Soviet citizens. My dad at the end of the war was stationed in Ampfing for a while. They talk about, they had a dance, and some of these Polish girls that were there, they ended up dancing, with the GIs, and Dad says, "I walked her home and I even kissed her." So it was cute how they fraternized. Anyway, the 14th also liberated 2 other camps nearby, one holding 1,500 Jewish prisoners and the other filled with Jewish female inmates. Of the 1,500 at the first camp, only 900 of them could walk. We all know about Nuremberg from the war trials. Dad and those 2 guys that we saw with him a while ago, Norman and Alan, who they call Goldie, they went through Nuremberg on the way to Paris. And he wrote that they walked through there until at dusk one night after they'd had dinner. And he said it's all so beat up, but still so remarkably scenic. So these are a couple of photos from that little walk that they took through the destroyed town. I have so few pictures of my father actually dressed like a medic. The only one I have with him with his actual armband is the one where he's getting the Bronze Star. But this is a stop they had at Morlock, Germany. You can see the medic vehicles. My dad is right here actually, sitting on the front of the Jeep. This was just a little rest stop. That house is still there. It was a rather aristocratic home that is now painted bright pink. You can see it very easily on Google Maps. I mentioned some of the mementos before. The coins aren't worth anything, I don't think. As far as I can tell, he brought home a lot of stamps. He loved collecting stamps, so wherever they were staying that was abandoned, he would just go through the mail there and cut out stamps. The flag was very important. It's 3 feet by 4 feet. At the end of the war, just like when the prisoners were liberated from these prison camps, they often had to go right back in. Because what are you going to do with 110,000 people with medical needs, transportation needs, all kinds of desperate human needs? So the same thing, when the war was over, these guys just can't go buy a plane ticket and come home either. So my dad was at Camp Home Run. Many of these camps were named for cigarettes. And we were talking about cigarettes earlier. I forget who I was talking with that, but there was Camp Lucky Strike and Camp Terryton. And so my dad ended up being Camp Home Run. He writes that, after the war's over, they had such a push near the end. The guys got the jitters from not doing anything, not being at war. So they built a baseball field. And he writes home to his mother and dad and says, there is a lack of American flags over here. Can you please send me a flag? So they did. Went downtown and bought a flag. You can't see it, but up in the left corner, my grandmother wrote the date she mailed it, and then Dad wrote on the right, on the white binding, when he first hoisted it. And they had a special baseball game at Camp Home Run, and it was to honor Lester Pruitt, who was a Class A baseball player in the United States, who was working his way up to the major leagues. Unfortunately, he was killed in the war and buried. He is buried at Epinal. Did I skip ahead? Yes, I did. Okay. Anyway, I recently added this slide. I was telling Rich that I've parted with all of these things. Dad brought these things home, and the red flag is interesting. He sends this home to his mother and dad, and it was in pristine condition. And my grandmother writes back to him, "We received the flag. It's so beautiful. Did you have it cleaned?" Which is funny because, of course, he's not going to be able to go to a dry cleaners in war-torn Germany. These are some of the items he collected, and I did sell them to help finance the book. I have always found this one so disturbing when I learned about the Liebesborn, and this was the women supporting, the creation of more perfect Aryan babies. And there's a number of documentaries out that probably some of you have seen about Hitler's children, and the movie that's about the children of the right-hand men of Hitler. And these movies are, lots of these people are still living. And they have stories to tell, like we all do. So, I still didn't feel like I had enough information. My husband's a college professor who serves on a international consortium of media people worldwide. And he had a conference in Belgium in summer of 2013. So we decided to go and stay longer and retrace some of Dad's footsteps. And one of the things we did was to go to the Lorraine American Cemetery. Some of you may have been there. We hear about Normandy Cemetery a lot on television and in the media. The reason I wanted to go here, 11 of the men in Dad's company are buried here, and these are men he watched die, the men he cared for. And we just felt that it'd be a tribute to these fellows to go there. I was afraid to do this. I didn't think I could handle that. And I'm so glad we did. It was summer. We drive up there. It looked like an American national park. And you think, we're in France. How can this look like the United States? We got out of the taxi. It smelled like roses. How can this be so beautiful? And it's a cemetery. And fortunately, they don't show you all the graves at once. Fortunately, it's very slowly revealed to you. And the staff was excellent. They treat you like family, even if you're not. We had printed out from online the American Battle Monuments Commission of where each of the graves were. And so we went and photographed every one of them. I'll tell you a little bit more about Herman Carnes in a minute. These were friends of his. Bill Heimer sadly died just a few days before the war was over. These ones really got me, where it says, "Here rests in honored glory, a comrade in arms known but to God." And I stood there and sobbed, because that's somebody's son, and that's somebody's brother, and it could be somebody's husband. And now, of course, it's someone's daughter, or someone's wife, or someone's mother. So it was very, very moving to see those. The whole experience was very beautiful, except for death. Inside the monument there is this beautiful, beautiful expression of remembrance for the soldiers that are buried there. There also is a wall with 444 names of those missing in action. So, we came home from that trip and I thought, I still don't have enough information. I really wanted to put the book together chronologically so that I had Dad's journal and the letters to and from him on the same day. But I didn't know what was exactly always going on in the war that would explain it more. So I found out about the morning reports. that are housed at the National Archives in St. Louis, this document on your left. So I hired a researcher to acquire those for me. And I got those, and it was so exciting, and then I realized I still didn't have enough information because it still didn't tell me. It just told me locations and who was missing in action and who was killed, wounded, and sick. My dad's records burned up in the 1973 fire at the National Archives. I would love to have those medical records, but they are gone. So I found out about the unit histories that are housed at the College Park, Maryland archives. So I had another researcher acquire those for me. When I got those, and it's detailed sometimes down to every 15 minutes what they're doing, I thought, now I have enough information to really put this together and really tell the story of what happened to my dad during that year. Excuse me. Well, I would love for you to read the book. I want to share a couple of excerpts from it with you. I had to decide where to start the book. And I decided to start with 2 days after Pearl Harbor. See my dad there at the top of the picture, and Lucy, who we've met before. This is my grandmother. That's my grandfather. And you look at him, you go, that's a really old man. He was 12 years older than her. They met when she was 18. And right away they hit it off and fell in love. And he's, and a few months went by and he said, I want to marry you. And she says, nope, I want to go to college. I want to go to college. And he says, really? And she goes, yep. So she went to college and she graduated in 1917. Now this is World War I. This is a woman going to college during World War I from small rural Indiana, and she graduated with a degree in journalism. She worked on the school paper. She was an amazing writer, genealogist, as Rich mentioned before. Before the internet, people would just show up at her house and say, I've got my relatives all figured out except this little piece, can you help me? Well, she graduated, but her mother had said, now you can't marry him. He's so old, you're going to be a widow for a long time, He's going to die young. Well, no, he's going to die at a good age, but he's going to... Anyway, he lived to be 80. And the reason he looks so old here, he'd had a horrible lung abscess and had been in a bed for a whole year of 1935, 1936. So he never quite was the same after that. Anyway, she graduated from college. She married him a week later, just at school, Her parents didn't even come because her mother wasn't for it. Anyway, they had 6 children and a wonderful life together. My dad at this time was in college on December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. And my grandmother wrote him a letter. This is an excerpt from it. She says, patriotism is fine, but I do hate to hear people trying to arouse racial hatred. I heard a congressman say, let's exterminate those war-mad Jap devils from the face of the earth. There may be a group of leaders who do deserve to be wiped out, but most of the Jap soldiers are boys just like you, with homes and families and ambitions of their own. And it isn't their fault they are made to fight. Why can't the poor old earth just learn to exterminate war? Now I get chills every time I read that. When I read that the first time, it was so powerful, of a mother who knew that her 3 sons were going to war. And we know what that can feel like. And, what she thought was going to happen is what happened. Not only that, her daughter also went. So these are my 2 uncles. Jonas on the left, he went off and volunteered because he wanted to be an officer. And he became a sub-chaser captain. He got malaria, was incredibly ill with it for a very, very long time. Was all over the South Pacific, hospitalized one place or another. David graduated from high school, 18 years old, immediately went off 1 week later to war. He was a very quiet man and never said much about it. He was also in the South Pacific. I don't think any man has ever been too excited to see this in their mailbox. And I know my dad wasn't happy to see this. He wrote in his journal on January 1, 1943, "What this year holds for me is of course unknown, but what this year holds for this good earth and its people is a much greater unknown. Only partially though, because it is easy to foresee that with this terrible war many human lives must be shed all in foolishness. If only the great military leaders, those merciless murderers, could spend a few hours with me just walking around and observing these wonderful things in and around home. How they would surely lay down their arms and enjoy the wonders of this world. Nature always at her loveliest." So we know how he felt about going. And I have to say, my husband and I this morning went on a Statue of Liberty tour. All my life I've wanted to do that, and finally today I got to do it. Perfect day for it. And I couldn't tell you how emotional it was to come up to it and see it on the boat. I started crying, and I thought of the 1.5 million men that departed from Camp Shanks up the Hudson River here. We're going to the museum tomorrow and having a tour. But I thought of what all those men felt when they saw the last glimpses of home as their troop ship went past the Statue of Liberty or their troop train had passed by it. I thought what that symbol of freedom meant to them. And their dad writes about, looking backwards, seeing the last bit of land, behind him. And so I just sobbed like a baby. Michael did too. It's very, very emotional. I was so glad to be able to go there today. The second little thing I want to read you from the book is about the day Dad was wounded. I've only recently acquired these pictures. We think it is almost exactly where my father was wounded. Where we live in Oregon is wine country. We live among vineyards, and it's very beautiful. And when Dad wrote he was wounded in a vineyard, I thought, surely there was protection. You could hide behind the leaves, not remembering it's December, right? There's no leaves. There's no leaves to hide behind. So he wrote this after many weeks after it occurred. He says, "December 18th, we moved up during the night to Wiesenberg and proceeded to attack Oberrauderbach, Germany. As we moved through a vineyard, we got a nice welcome of mortars and 88s, indeed my so-called baptism of fire. As I lay on the ground waiting for one to drop on me, I was hit in the upper right arm by shrapnel. Boy, was I praying, sweating, cursing, and whatnot. And what a sensation, sting as they say. Moved my fingers and was much relieved to see them move, then cautiously looked at my arm and about then heard a guy call in great pain. So I said to hell with my arm and took off. Crawled through to Pop Carnes and found him in bad shape. Helped Sergeant Close, who had a neck wound. LaPointe was all shot up. Dragged LaPointe to ditch and went back after Pop. With the aid of Jennings, who was half out of his mind, we finally got Pop to ditch. What agony, makes me sick to think of it. Why I wasn't killed during that hour or so, I do not know. Pop died in an hour or so with concussion, and I'm satisfied I did my best under such conditions. I hope the other guys think so too. The least I could do was say a little prayer for him. I hope it helped. It was terrible. Enough of that. My arm started bothering me in the middle of the afternoon, so I turned into the aid station. Hazelton took my place. I felt really cowardly, chicken, or whatever one might say. So to me, it's just such an amazing story that he stayed on the battlefield and kept working for probably 6 hours before he got medical attention himself. In researching shrapnel, I've learned a lot about shrapnel, that if the wounds are small, because it's hot when it goes in, it cauterizes it, so you don't bleed out, If the pieces are big or if you're covered with lots of shrapnel wounds, it's another matter. But he sort of makes light out of it, at the time, but he was in the hospital for 2 months. It was that serious. And all those records are burned up. I'd be dying to know what they say. This is a picture of sort of the after effect of this battle. This man, who's climbing down from the tank, is 6'7", as is his son, who has become a great friend of mine. One of the best things about the book for me has been the people I've met in groups like this, and also I found children of guys that my dad served with. Now, through Buster Crockett, who we saw before, I met this man. 25-year career Army guy, tank guy. Had to retire because he stood up in a tank turret in Afghanistan and was shot right above his heart. And, fortunately, they got him within 10 minutes to where he could get help. So now he works in military records as a contractor at Fort Knox. How handy that's been for me to have someone with the inside track. Plus, his father, Ray, who we see here, married a German woman. Now, I always assumed that was right after World War II because that happened a lot. It wasn't. It was 26 years later because his dad was career military. So he's raised in Germany. He speaks German. We spent hours and hours on the phone correcting German names, tracing maps, him on the phone in Kentucky, me in Oregon, trying to make sure we had the route exactly right so we could put it in the book right. So Eric's just been a great resource to me. The reason that I have this slide here, this Oberauerbach battle, they could not win. There was no way they were going to win. C Company went in on the left side of the town, and it was sort of like, actually, this hill that's right back here by the library. Oberauerbach is flat and with vineyards, and then there's a hill that goes up. They didn't realize that hill was full of pillboxes and fortifications, and apparently their scouting was bad to have not determined that. So they go to try to take this town, and B Company, who Ray was in, they get all the way through the town, and there's a cemetery right there at the north part of town. It's right next to the Siegfried Line, what used to be there, the Siegfried Line, and they was trapped in the cemetery, for hours. And you can imagine what a soldier would think, I'm in a cemetery and I'm being shot at. This doesn't look good, It doesn't look good for the outcome. Anyway, he got shot in the knee, and we can see that here, with the blood running that has stained his pants. So when I asked his son about this picture, he sent me Ray's account of it. And when Ray got shot in the knee, of course, it impaired his movement, and he was ordered to take 8 walking wounded back to the aid station. And so some tanks ended up transporting these people because there was 4 kilometers back, and if you got a bullet in your knee, you're not going to be able to walk 4 kilometers. So this is after he's finally being taken down from the tank to go to the aid station. There were 29 men wounded or killed on that first day. The attack lasted for 5 days and nights until the Americans had to retreat. 36 men were killed in action and 64 others wounded. It was just a huge, huge loss for them. They did go back there a few months later and did take the town at that time. In my book, I have a map of the attack plan on page 110. Now, lots of you have seen this map, I'm sure. The reason I have it up here is just to show the intensity of the final days of the war. Dad was in the 3rd Army originally. Is that true? No, he was in the... Which was Patton, 7th or 3rd?
3rd.
3rd, okay. Dad was in the 7th, and just near the end of the war, they got transferred to Patton's. Okay, so, but the reason I'm showing this is because his particular company was in 146 German towns in April. And Dad writes, they got 4 days rest in there, but it wasn't rest, it was just stopping. He says, by the end of the war, we couldn't get supplies. I didn't even have a set of clean ODs, no new clothing. And they shared what they had. This map is just a rough approximation of where they went. But 22 of those towns in one day. And some of them, were empty. Some of them they had to fight for. Some of them were really horrible, horrible fights. But it's just a grueling, grueling thing there at the end. Now this looks like a black screen. I wanted to share this medic footage with you because there's very little medic footage available online that I've found anyway. And I've watched this film probably 100 times. I tried to find my father's face in it the first 20 times. And then I thought, Karen, that's stupid. Go and look in the journal and see where he actually was, right? And he was probably about 10 miles from this. My dad does not appear in this footage, but some very, very important people do. There's shrapnel wounds. what the division history says about this setting right here is it's in Kirchenberg, Germany, April 15th, 1945. It says the troop crossed the Main River. The 3rd platoon, leading the 68th, got into a firefight near Kirchenberg with the withdrawing Germans. The Germans were moving over a hill, and the platoon laid in on them with 50 caliber guns. The attached tank destroyers moved up to fire on towns on the reverse slope of the hill and set afire a group of German barracks. One of the platoon's armored cars was hit by an enemy round. The driver and radio operator were wounded. The car commander was blown out of the turret and the gunner was wounded. So we think that these guys on the ground were these men they're just referring to, particularly the man with that much shrapnel wounds. Now the footage is out of order. I'm finding lots of newsreels like this are out of order online. But what's really also super significant about this particular piece of film was it was filmed by Walter Rosenblum. Does anybody know Walter Rosenblum? He is one of the most famous American photographers, and he is the first to document Nazi atrocities. He landed at Normandy. He wanted to be a filmmaker, and so he was in the Signal Corps, but they sent him over as a still photographer. When they landed at Normandy, the movie photographer was killed. So he ended up with the equipment, and he followed around the 14th Armored Division a lot. And he's responsible for some of the very famous Normandy photos we've all seen. When I learned about Walter Rosenblum, I got off on sort of a 2-week side trip in research and watched a documentary about him and looked at a lot of his photographs and saw an interview, there's his name, with him that was filmed by the National Holocaust Museum. The other thing that I find super significant about this film is these young boys. By the end of the war, the German soldiers, a lot of them were really young kids. And I think Rosenblum really focused on that boy's face for a long time because he's so young. And I just have, the faces of the people say so much in this. The other thing that's really wonderful about this film is, while my father's not in it, John L. Battenfeld, his commanding officer, is. And some cows. Dad writes about cows. He writes a lot about staying in German homes. I think because he was a medic, he ended up being billeted in people's houses a lot. And he wrote, "What gets me in these houses is the barn next door. You open a door thinking it's going into a bedroom, and what you know, you're in a stable with 3 or 4 cows. You walk out on the front porch, and there lies a stinking pile of stuff they cleaned out of the stables. Some of these houses stink so bad I don't see how people can stand to live in them. The higher the pile, the higher the status. Ha! Sometimes our animals are even kept in the cellar below the house." Now you can see here, John Battenfield, this is his commanding officer, and I think his face tells a tremendous story about the end of the war. I've met his son over the phone. In fact, he lives not far from here, and he talked about his father came home and was a doctor. Actually, when he was drafted, he was in his mid-30s. And he just looked so haggard and horrible here near the end of the war. And his son told me he had terrific PTSD, for most of his life. I don't see why everybody doesn't. But another man that was in here holding the plasma bag, that was Norman Eliasson, who we saw earlier, who took all the photos. There's Battenfeld's face. That's just so amazing. This film also represents that as a medic, you treat your own people, but you also treat the injured Germans. Okay, now I was talking to Rich about what my dad brought home from the Berghof. These things are such treasures to me. When I found these cleaning out my mother's house, I clutched them to me, and my brothers looked at me like I was insane. Why are these important? Why they're important because I knew what they were. My dad wrote home to his mother and said, "Yesterday I had the occasion to visit Hitler's own Berchtesgaden, quite some place and well taken care of by the Air Corps. Hitler's house was strictly kaput, and I do mean kaput. What wasn't blasted by bombs was gutted by fire. His famous living room with spacious window had snow-covered mountains in front, was intact but all burned out. He sure had what looked to be quite a ritzy joint. We weren't permitted to visit the tunnels beneath. I got a few souvenirs, which were few and far between due to the destruction, and GIs who had captured and visited the place. Enclosed were suitable ones to send in a letter. So my dad, typical my dad, is outside picking wildflowers at the most evil place on earth, you know? So, but I love it. So he sends these home, and grandmother mounts them. These are just little index cards. She goes, leaves and grass from Hitler's backyard. And it's just so funny to me. But these are real treasures, but it represents who my dad was. In the book, he talks a lot about seeing plants and talking about picking a helmet full of chestnuts and picking any fruit that's off the trees. Soldiers talked a lot about the food because they didn't have enough, you know, most of the time. Anyway, these are his medals, both received on the same day, for the same day, December 18th, 1944. The Bronze Star for Valor on the Battlefield, and Purple Heart. And I didn't realize until I was writing this book, I was born 10 years to the day later. And surely I hope that that turned a really bad day for my dad into a good day, you know. But I never knew that all my life. Anyway, I'd love to take your questions. Anyone have a question?
How did he find himself in the medical corps?
Great question. Rich wanted to know, how did he find himself in the medical corps? He was studying to be a doctor. He was in pre-med at Indiana University. And he had been in ROTC in high school. And so, and then he was in the ASTP program first. They put him in that. He was at the University of Cincinnati. But then he trained at Camp Campbell, Fort Campbell. And he writes that he was in a hospital there that was only for men that were sick in their mind. And so, you know, he got an early taste of soldiers who'd come back mentally destroyed. But he writes vividly about loving surgery there. Well, of course, as a medic, he had the absolute worst possible conditions for anything. So that because he was already studying medicine. So many medics, I think, were put in, I've read a number of medic memoirs, and some were just said, I can't even stand the sight of blood, and they made me a medic, you know. Does that make sense?
That's the Army for you.
That's the Army for you, okay. Who else? Somebody else had a question. Yeah?
What did your dad do after?
That's a great question. My dad did not become a doctor. My mother said, why didn't you become a doctor? We would have had some money. You know, I heard that so many times. He went back to school, and then, you know, I think just because he had to. You know, he came home, I'm sure pretty disoriented, you know. And then he started dating my mother. They weren't dating before that, before the war. They knew each other. They had grown up together. But then after he got out of college, he messed around for a long time, and all of his relatives were kind of like, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? And he lived across from a church. It was the perfect setup. I mean, here's his school right here. Here's his house. Here's the church. Here's the grandparents. You could not get into any trouble, you know. But he went to a church and to some meeting one night and had an epiphany to become a minister, and he did. That's what he did. And I always say to people, I'm not sure that was easier. It was just less bloody, you know. So that's what he did all of his life, and he was particularly interested in working with youth groups during Vietnam. His war experience made him a pacifist, absolutely. He worked actively for peace the rest of his life. During Vietnam, there were a couple of boys that he helped with conscientious objector applications. That was very important work for him. And yeah. Need a microphone?
The waves were started at the beginning of the Second World War. But I have a classmate of mine from medical school. His father was at the Fort Hamilton VA, and he went with his mother to visit, and she fell right in front of it and broke her leg, and they took her in. He said, well, now you'll have to go to a hospital. Why not this hospital? This is only for veterans. Wait a minute, she opened a pocketbook. There was a veteran's card from the First World War. They had people in the Navy, they just weren't called waves. They gave them some other name. And they basically did the paperwork in the office so that people could relieve, to do some, go on ships, et cetera, et cetera. So,
That's a great story. Yes.
How did he get there and how did he get back? Liberty ship, the Havre, back to Brooklyn?
Great question. He was in a convoy, a small convoy. Most convoys I learned were 35 ships. He was in a convoy of 18 ships. Only 3 of them had troops on them. He left from Camp Shanks, right up an hour north of here, October 16th, 1944. It took them 2 weeks to get to Marseille. They zigzagged across the Atlantic, and they didn't even tell the soldiers until 2 days before they were landing where they were going. He was seasick much of the time. But he writes vividly about coming along the Strait of Gibraltar and landing in Marseille and being young and only having been in Indiana and not knowing anything about French people. So you can see him grow up in the book. When you read the book, you see him grow up and you see it in a hurry. He left from, well, at the end of the war, he was afraid he was going to have to go to Japan because he was a medic, So he volunteered to be in is it CIC? CCI? I can't get that right. So he ended up with the 2 other medics, Norman and Alan. They ended up in Paris for 6 weeks. And if they hadn't done that, they would have gone home earlier. But they ended up finally leaving from Le Havre. And they came back pretty fast that time. And actually, he walked the gangplank here in New York. It was a year to the day that he left and the day he came back, which is amazing. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm friends with a fellow that was in Stalag 7A when he passed away, Laverne Reynolds, and I'm friends with Steve Denny, whose father was in the same prison. And they handled it differently when Patton came in. John went running through the fields, and they went looking for food and everything else. And Laverne just, hung out there. In fact, there was a bullet that went through because they attacked just before they gave up. And there was a bullet that went through the tent he was in. But he stayed there, and they put him on guard duty in the town right there in Moosburg. He said, I had no idea what I was supposed to guard. I thought I was on guard duty, but it was nice to be out. Mm-hmm. But the whole thing about when they raised the flag in the town on the tower, when everyone was in tears. I mean, this is like they were in this awful prison. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, and the whole thing with Patton coming there was staged after the fact, too.
He didn't come in right away, but
right.
When he came in, he had his pistols and...
Right, and Dad writes some derogatory comments about him coming in. He says, now I believe everything they've said about Patton. So, yeah, but there's some definitely footage online you can see of that. Wow, it's neat that you knew people that were there.
Yeah, in fact, Laverne never told his family about it. And I wrote a book, and he was in the book, and he got together with his 2 daughters and his granddaughter, and he wrote down all his experiences, because he started in Stalag, in the Great Escape Prison,
wow.
Stalag Luft 3, and then he went down to Nuremberg, and then he was on that march. So he was on 2 marches. One march going from Sagan, Poland, to Spremberg for the train ride down to Nuremberg, and then they actually had to march down to Stalag 7A in Moosburg, because that was for enlisted guys. He was an officer, so he was in, they're treated a little bit better.
He was in the better prison camp.
Right, in the better prison, but he ended up in the worst one.
Gosh, yeah.
Camp Campbell, Kentucky,
Yeah.
became Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the home of the 101st Airborne.
Right.
Was your father airborne?
No.
Did they have airborne at that time?
Not, they did, but that he wasn't attached to them. Yeah. Yeah. Did you have another question?
Yeah. Did he ever go back to Europe after the war and visit any of the spots that he was in?
That's a great question. Rich wanted to know if he ever went back to visit those spots. Yes, he did. In 1960, there was an international convention of the Christian Church in Edinburgh. So he and my mother and my older brother, who was 8 at the time, went back. And then Norman, who the photographer, was working in Europe at that time. He had a Volkswagen Bug, and they all piled in that, and they went driving around to places they've been, and I have the slides from that trip. And because Michael and I hope to go there this next summer to Oberoderbach. I want to see that exact spot, but he went back. And I have slides of them picking wildflowers there. But, and Eric Lohoff and I have tried and tried and tried to find the exact spot because it was in a vineyard on a hillside. And so there's a limit. There's a professor of geology who does tours of Oberoderbach now. They're like a 7-hour hiking tour. Part of it's to see how the earth has recovered from the war, but it's to look at these gun emplacements and pillboxes and things. And it's a big tour. You got to be fit to go on this thing. He's been trying to help us pinpoint exact locations because he's an expert on this particular battle. So, yes, he did go back. He refers to it later when he's wounded in December. They do go back to it in like early March, and he refers to it as a suicide place in his writings at the time. And I think because it was suicide to go in there, there was just no way they were going to come out of that okay. And they lost so many guys. But I want to go there. I want to go cry there. And I will.
It'll be a good experience.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Did any of the people he had treated contact him, or did he come in contact with any of those?
After the fact,
Yes.
there's a beautiful letter in the book written to him by Claude Wilson. And it's written from Claude from the hospital. Well, they're still at war. And he writes about the experience of my dad coming to treat him. And it is such a beautiful letter about him thanking my dad for that. But it also really shows who my dad was. And I remember so much in life, I would talk to my dad about, someone died. And he said, you have to care for the living. And where did that come from? That came from the war experience, right? But I think that he kept in touch with some people, the people that he had treated. Later on in his life, he did start going to some of those battalion reunions. And I found lists of medics, of their addresses throughout the years. But since he didn't talk about it, I didn't know that. And I always think, when you're a teenager, you just want your parents to go away, But, when you're this age or when you're 80, your parents would be super handy, Because all those things that you want to ask or all that advice you still need, And so the things I would ask now, and, I'm just so grateful that all these people through the years kept all this stuff. And it's almost like this story was left for me. This story was left for me who avoids... the first time I saw Private Ryan, it was like this, it's like, I can't watch that. But, my brother called me up and he says, I just watched Private Ryan. It makes me understand what Dad must have gone through. And I thought, I have to watch that. I have to know. And for me, I think the opportunity to know your 22-year-old father is rare. And while it's been horribly painful at times, what an experience. It has radically changed my life, and for the better, And so I've been trying to find some of these people, and some of the people I found, it's been so wonderful. I didn't talk about, when he talked about Pop Carnes, it's Herman Carnes' gravestone we saw. Pop Carnes was 37 years old. It's why they called him Pop, because he was old, right? Compared to these 18 to 22-year-old boys. Now, in my research trying to find that family, because I thought, did Pop Carnes have a son? Maybe he'd like to know how his father had died, and that he wasn't alone, that there was somebody who stayed with him till he died. In researching that family, I got chills thinking about this, I found out my dad and he were fifth cousins. But I don't think they knew it, because, go on genealogy, I found that his grandparents are buried in the same cemetery as my great-grandparents. And I went, whoa. And I traced it, and I found they didn't have any children. In fact, the sadder thing about the Pop Carnes story, his wife died just 8 months before him of tuberculosis. She was so worried that her husband was at war that she couldn't eat. And so she just died even sooner. So that family lost those two young people, to me young, at that time. But to me, whether my father kept in touch with those people is unknown to me except for what I have. But finding the Carnes family, they didn't have any children, but I did find 2 nephews, one who is in the service, who has been to his grave in the Lorraine Cemetery, and the other one, I sent a book to him because I just wanted them to know, because they knew about him. They knew that that uncle had died. But to me, that was so important. If you could tell somebody that their son who died in war was not alone, that was a big deal to me. And it was a great experience. So,
Karen, I've been to the cemetery at Courbevoie and also to the one in Italy. And I had no idea that the cemetery that you showed us had 8,000 or 9,000 bodies buried there.
it actually is 10,349.
They probably brought some home too, didn't they?
Well, I asked about that when I was there. That cemetery is the compilation of 4 temporary World War II cemeteries. That the French government gave the U.S. that land, and that those bodies were all moved there. And I think, in the 1950s somehow. And it's a former, I think it was a military academy site. That's Michael's saying, that's right, because they have a plaque there. But that cemetery, I'd never heard of it either, and it's almost to the German border. If you go to Paris, we took a train out to Metz, which is a huge World War I and World War II site, has an incredible memorial there that the Nazis defaced, World War I memorial. But then we go farther to Saint-Avold, and it looks like there's going to be transportation there. There isn't. You get out of the train and then it's like, oh, it's implied it's a short walk. It's not. It's like 8 kilometers and it's uphill. So we took a taxi, but that cemetery is huge. And in researching American cemeteries, there are 25 throughout the world. My understanding is that there are 220,000 people buried in them, which is massive.
Having seen a number of the American cemeteries in France and in Belgium, yes, definitely, and they all feel absolutely so moving. You said you felt like you were in a park. They are so beautifully maintained, and the grass is mowed by young French boys. And there's so many people in the United States who say the French have no feeling for our part in the war. Absolutely wrong. They are so grateful. I don't know about the kids today, but certainly the people we met through the years, very grateful. And they maintain those cemeteries perfectly.
It was perfect. It was perfect except for death. And while we were there, it was hot that day. They were mowing. The 4 guys at parallel diagonals and mowing, and the sprinklers were on. But they were watching us like a hawk. It's like wherever we were approaching a grave, they'd stop mowing. If we were trying to photograph, they would stop. They'd turn the sprinklers off. People little golf carts are delivering flowers to graves. You can order flowers from anywhere to be put on a soldier's grave anywhere at one of these cemeteries. But yeah, I mean, it was such an oxymoron to be perfect except for death, There's not a blade of grass out of place. I mean, the stones are all straight. There's no weed eater marks. There's none of that. It is so phenomenally beautiful. Yeah.
The American Battle Monuments Commission, they run that, so that's why they probably look American.
Right.
But they're all very, very, very emotional if you visit them.
Right. Herman Carden's grave, I stood there and sobbed for a long, long time because I felt like I knew him. And how beautiful to at least do this for these guys, Yes, sir.
Were any of the bodies removed and brought back to the United States?
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that question. I asked the staff at the cemetery because they have an American staff person and a French staff person. And I said, why are these bodies here? Why didn't they come home? And they said, you had the choice. They had the choice. And there's a lot of it's kind of an old tradition that people bury their soldiers where the body fell, and I think people made that decision. So Herman Carnes happens to have a gravestone marker in Missouri also, too, but his body is not there. But I don't know if anybody's were removed after they put them there. I think at the time the families had the choice, are we sending this body home or is it staying here? And I don't know if you can change your mind later. I bet you can, but I bet then probably you would have to pay that expense.
There was a law passed